Hey, if you're watching this video, first of all, congratulations, you have excellent taste and impeccable decision making. And look at you, I mean, you're so good looking, I just want to give you a little pinch. But secondly, get ready to hear the phrase RPG a lot, like a lot in this video. It might get to the point where you just forget what the term RPG means, but I mean, that'd be fine, you'd hardly be the only one. The term RPG means role-playing game, which is kind of where the problems begin, because if I'm playing Super Mario 64, then I'm playing the role of Mario. Is Super Mario 64 an RPG? No, it's not. It's a platformer, which is a game all about maneuvering between platforms, however that may be framed. So then it feels like the term RPG is inherently confusing, because it feels like a term that should apply to every game ever. And I'm not just talking about video games either, I'm talking about every game ever. When you play a game of tag and you're it, you're playing the role of the person who is it. So is tag an RPG? Yeah, it's not. I'm sorry, I don't know why I lied to you. If you really wanted to be that guy, then you could probably argue that tag was an RPG based on the term RPG alone, just because the term is so loose and non-specific. By this logic, I don't know if the term RPG should ever have quite caught the traction that it did, because in this day and age, I feel like it's being used for far more things than it was ever intended to. Without even bringing video games into consideration, there is a very deep and rich history to the role-playing game. I'm sure a lot of people watching this video have a general idea of the history of the RPG and know about Dungeons and Dragons and all that stuff, but I really don't feel like the history of RPGs is necessary to talk about in this video. You don't need to hear about how the pioneers scratched their OCs into cave paintings or anything like that. All you need to know is that the term RPG used to be a lot more specific and a lot more meaningful, probably because there were a lot less games around back then and they were capable of less. It was either play Dungeons and Dragons with your friends or play Pong, or go push your little hoop around with a stick or something, I don't know. It feels like nowadays we've come to this modern understanding that any game with numbers, stats and levels in it is an RPG. These are the factors that separate the RPGs from the platformers, the shooters, the fighting games and everything else. But does this really tell the whole story? Because I mean, yeah, the oldest RPGs, even before they became video games, stuff like Dungeons and Dragons, they had all this stuff. They had numbers and stats and level ups, but they also had role-playing. You can jump in games like Mortal Kombat. Does that make it a platformer? No, because there's no platforms. But conversely, we call games like Kingdom Hearts RPGs because there's all these numbers and stats and levels, but the question you need to ask yourself is there any role-playing in Kingdom Hearts? Admittedly, Kingdom Hearts is a bit of a weird example because it's often called a JRPG, and believe me, that's a whole other thing that I don't really feel experienced enough to talk about in this video. I think it speaks to how misused the term RPG is in the first place, that there's a whole subgenre with RPG in the name that is almost a completely different thing. But either way, Kingdom Hearts is often referred to as one of these two things. Though if you compare it to other more traditional RPGs of old, does it really do anything the same aside from the stats and numbers and levels? Think about the term role-playing in isolation. What's the role you play in Kingdom Hearts? It's Sora. Do you have any agency over that? No, Sora is going to be the exact same person every single time you play Kingdom Hearts. The only decisions you get to make in regards to Sora is how he plays. You get to make decisions that affect the game's core mechanics and the combat, sure, but you don't get to make any decisions that affect the characters or the story in any meaningful way. The story will always be the same and always reach the same conclusion, and the characters around you, much like Sora, will all continue down a predetermined path. The only thing that's going to change between playthroughs is those gameplay-based decisions, like the questions that you answer at the beginning of the game. Would you rather have high attack in exchange for low defense and all that stuff? That's about the single most interesting and impactful decision you'll get to make throughout the whole game. So yeah, there's a bit of agency in regards to the game's core mechanics, but there's nothing you can do within that core gameplay that will change anything outside of the core gameplay. You can choose which order you go to the Disney worlds in to a certain extent, but you're almost always going to go to them all anyway. So there, I've established why I don't consider Kingdom Hearts to be an RPG of any kind. But let me veer off a little bit and really quickly compare it to another game that you might might not think is comparable to it at all. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Hear me out here. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 has you playing as the same protagonist or protagonists throughout the whole game, and there's nothing you can do to change those protagonists' paths or personalities. They are just those characters. The games will always begin and end the same, and there's nothing you can do within the core gameplay to affect anything outside of the core gameplay. Really, the decisions in Modern Warfare 2 range from, I'm going to pick up this gun and use this one instead, or I'm going to shoot that guy before I shoot that guy. I want to make it clear that I'm not criticizing either of these games. I love Modern Warfare 2 and I love Kingdom Hearts 2, but these games award you more or less the same freedoms. How one of them is considered an RPG and one of them isn't kind of baffles me. Realistically, I don't think either of them should be considered RPGs. I think Kingdom Hearts is a hack and slash, but it becomes clear that people define Kingdom Hearts as an RPG because of the stats and the numbers and the levels and all that stuff. There's only one number that matters in Call of Duty, and that's 360, baby. Ooh! Nice. But it's not an RPG, is it? It just kind of seems that any game under the sun nowadays with RPG elements like stats, numbers and levels in it is considered an RPG. I think a game like Kingdom Hearts has way more in common with something like Bayonetta or Devil May Cry than it does with, say, Dungeons and Dragons or Dragon Age. Hell, you know what else is more of an RPG than Kingdom Hearts? Cluedo. Sure, when I play Cluedo and I pick Professor Plum, which I will, I'm playing as an already established character with a name, gender and occupation. But at least when I'm playing Cluedo, I have some kind of influence over how the game ends. I have more freedom in the role I play. Is Cluedo an RPG? Sorry, I'll stop. It's more of an RPG than Kingdom Hearts though. A game like Cluedo at least has less restrictions in how you play the game and how you change the game around you than a lot of the modern video games that we consider to be RPGs for whatever reason. So we've come to understand how most people classify an RPG today, and we've come to the conclusion that said classification is generally wrong. Most people see RPG elements and immediately shout RPG, but most of these games aren't allowing you to play any role beyond the already fully realized main character. You can't change that character's personality or actions in any meaningful way. So if we're going to have a term that's as universal as role-playing games still exist, then we need to make sure that we're applying it correctly. Let's save the term and be a little bit more conservative with it, and try and be more certain that the games that we're calling RPGs are the ones that put the emphasis on the role-playing. Now, what separates the real RPGs from the fake RPGs? I've talked a lot about games that get called RPGs but I don't think are actually RPGs, so what kind of game do I actually think should be considered one? Well, if you ask me, there are three defining factors that make up what we should call an RPG, and I've touched on them quite a lot intermittently throughout the video, so I'll summarize. In my opinion, for a game to be considered an RPG, obviously first and foremost it has to let you choose the role you play. This means you're not stuck with one main playable character who can't be changed in any way whatsoever. A lot of the games that are actually RPGs, in my opinion, generally have customizable protagonists, but they don't have to be fully customizable. They can have default names that they'll use if you can't be bothered to make one up, but they should be customizable within a certain kind of range. You should be able to change elements of their appearance and have some influence over their backstory, relationships and dialogue and all that stuff. If this is done right, it should have a domino effect that kind of triggers the second defining feature of an RPG. That being that your actions inside of the core gameplay, stuff like fighting and combat or dialogue or whatever it might be, should have an effect on other things outside of that core gameplay. This means that you have more decisions to make than just having ones that pertain to your numbers and your stats and your abilities. You're able to express how you feel your character should function through more than just fighting enemies. You have a morality that's more interesting than I'm good because I killed all the bad guys, or I'm bad because I let all the bad guys live. There's just way more room for expression when you have multiple options to choose from, and those options have consequences on the world around you. And finally, as kind of a final part of that domino effect, as a result of the preceding two factors, the game should be extremely replayable. The potential should be there for the game's beginning and end to be quite different on different playthroughs. So let's take it a step further. Now that we know what we think makes an RPG, let's look at two games that do all three of these things and compare how they pull them off, so that maybe we can now decide what makes a good RPG. I'm going to compare two games that are quite similar in a lot of ways. They came out around the same time, they're functionally very similar. You'll see where I draw the relation. Fallout New Vegas was released in October of 2010 and Skyrim in November 2011, so just over a year between these two games. With these two examples, I feel like I can perfectly illustrate what makes a game an RPG, but also what makes a game an RPG that isn't quite as effective an RPG as it could be, and alternatively, how a game can absolutely nail what an RPG in my mind should be. The characters you play as in Skyrim and New Vegas respectively are pretty blank slates. Courier and Dragonborn are the names given to these characters, but you're almost definitely going to pick one of your own. There's a bit of predetermined backstory to both characters. As the Courier, you miraculously survive being shot in the head and start the game talking to the doctor who has been taking care of you. In Skyrim, you don't immediately know that you're the Dragonborn. You're a random innocent being brought towards your execution for reasons that I don't really think are made that clear. It's not like I haven't paid enough attention to the intro of Skyrim or played through it enough times by now, but between what is, in my opinion, some pretty muddy audio quality on most of the character dialogue and some pretty hard to read subtitles, I always feel like I'm missing something. I don't know, maybe there's some important exposition that I've managed to miss every single time. I think it's implied that you've been spotted with the Stormcloaks and the opposing faction, the Imperials, have decided to just off you anyway because it's easier to do that and assume that you're a Stormcloak than do any paperwork and actually find out who you really are. Whereas Fallout New Vegas' intro is super concise, explains the background of the Courier quickly and efficiently, gives you a reason to be going on your journey, and then just kind of boots you out the front door with all the freedom in the world almost immediately, Skyrim's intro kind of feels like an excuse for you to customize your character. This whole thing has been leading to you standing in place and getting spoken to by this Imperial guy. It's super cryptic, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. There's nothing inherently wrong with not immediately telling you that you're the Dragonborn and this kind of gradual reveal of information. But if a game like Skyrim is going to do that, then it probably shouldn't make its intro so long, because as a result it ends up feeling extremely inefficient. In New Vegas, after you've finished customizing your character, you can just kind of get up and go and do whatever you want within about 5 or 10 minutes. After you've created your character in Skyrim, you've got about another half an hour to 45 minutes of linear, mandatory progression to go through before you're granted your own freedom. And again, the difference in time wouldn't be a problem if Skyrim was a bit more efficient with it, because it feels like Skyrim's intro is a lot longer than Fallout New Vegas's, and yet you learn a lot less. You could argue that the interplay between the Stormcloaks and the Imperials in Skyrim's intro speaks to some kind of world building, but I think that'd be a bit of a stretch. This kind of world building doesn't need to be forced on you in a mandatory cutscene where you can't move or do anything. In New Vegas, the world is really yours to build. Like I say, almost immediately you're given the setup. You're a courier delivering a supposedly very important package that led to someone shooting you in the head in an assassination attempt, and you miraculously survived. You learn this very quickly, customize your character, and then go outside to the game's starting area, Good Springs. You can talk to the locals about the guy who shot you in the head and try and gather more information about him, but you don't have to. You don't have to hang around. You can just leave Good Springs and go wherever you want. In the process of gathering more information, you'll find that they're being threatened by a group of escaped convicts. So you can side with the people of Good Springs and fight the convicts off. You can side with the convicts and wipe the town out entirely, or like I say, you can just leave. You don't have to follow the game's main plot thread at all. Sure, you'll probably stumble back on it at some point during the game on your adventures, but by that point things will have changed completely and the story will be playing out in a completely different way. And again, up until the very end of the game, more often than not, you have the option to just walk away from it all and do your own thing, because no story in New Vegas is more important than the story you want to tell. Alternatively, Skyrim's half an hour or so intro that doesn't really give you a lot to go on gives you one decision to really make throughout the whole thing aside from character creation, and that's go with the red guy or go with the blue guy. Two extremely bland characters who are going to help you break out of Helgen, the town you are being executed in, after it gets attacked by a dragon. These guys are supposed to represent the game's two main factions in the Stormcloaks and the Imperials, but they're both more or less the same guy, and regardless of who you choose to go with, nothing really changes. After this half an hour or 45 minute or so introduction where nothing really changes depending on who you pick, the game finally opens up. Red or blue guy suggests that you go to Riverwood to continue doing stuff there with them, but you can just kind of go wherever you want and do what you want, and that's cool. But what if you decide that the thing you want to do is kill red or blue guy? Maybe you're just kind of crazy. Well, you can't. You can't be crazy. You can't kill red or blue guy. They are unkillable NPCs. Skyrim has a story that it wants to tell you, and those characters are too important to that story, so you can't kill them, otherwise it would ruin it. The sad fact of the matter is that Skyrim prioritizes the story it wants to tell above your freedom. There's quite a lot of unkillable NPCs in this game that come to mind, the Greybeards, Jarl Balgruuf, and obviously these two. But the thing is that your role playing is limited to even more than that. So many of the dialogue options available to the Dragonborn in Skyrim just don't straddle a line whatsoever. They're not interesting. You get one option that's like good and you can be the good guy, or you get an option that's bad and you can be the bad guy. But let's say hypothetically you're trying to roleplay a bad guy and you pick all the bad guy options. I mean, you can't kill red and blue guy, you can't kill the Greybeards, you can't kill Jarl Balgruuf, so how bad really are you? Because you can only roleplay within like a certain sphere. And like I say, because of how bland and restrictive the dialogue options are, you can't really roleplay anything beyond good guy or bit of a like half bad guy. There's very little wit or intrigue or moral ambiguity available to you at all. And so, like I say, not only does Skyrim only let you choose the role you play to a very certain extent, but it's also not actually that replayable. I mean, it is replayable, but you're always going to be replaying that same half an hour, 45-minute segment where very little changes between those playthroughs. You only get one decision during that segment, not counting character creation, and nothing really changes based on that decision. So, I don't know, you're going to be doing that beginning a lot if you're replaying the game a lot, and it's probably going to get really boring. The ending of Skyrim isn't exactly flexible either, so I don't really think this game is that replayable. By virtue of its super snappy, decision-filled opening and multiple endings that are very different from one another, Fallout New Vegas is a lot more replayable, and it allows you to choose the role that you want to play in so many ways. In character customization alone, you get to pick from perks that change the way you interact with different types of people and creatures in the world, perks that don't just pertain to combat and gunplay. I'm talking stuff that opens up new dialogue options in speech, stuff that lets you flirt with people of the opposite sex or the same sex, and stuff that lets you eat people's dead body. Ooh, don't do that one. You get to allocate a certain amount of points to your special stats, as in charisma, intelligence, perception, and again, how high or low these might be will open up different dialogue options. The dialogue options in New Vegas are excellent. The choreo is genuinely funny, and also genuinely really stupid if your intelligence is low enough, and genuinely evil to like a hilarious extent. Every build, every role that you want to play in New Vegas is valid and catered to. There are no unkillable NPCs aside from your companions, who are optional encounters who can even die in higher difficulties. They're not important to the plot if you don't want them to be. There are no unkillable NPCs because the world is like a sandbox and you can play with it how you want. You can get fisted by a robot. You can not get fisted by a robot. The possibilities are endless. Fallout New Vegas is like an American. It just screams freedom at you. My bias here should be clear, and I'm not trying to turn this whole video into Fallout New Vegas versus Skyrim because Fallout would win. I do think that both games should be classified as RPGs, but I think that Skyrim is a decidedly less pure RPG than New Vegas because of how restrictive it can be. If both these games took you to the park, Skyrim would say, here's the park, don't jump off the slide, don't swing too high on the swings, don't go too high on the seesaw. Fallout New Vegas would say, here's the park, do a flip. To get off the whole Skyrim New Vegas thing, there's a couple other games I want to touch on in regards to this kind of definition of RPG that I've come to in this video. Pokemon. Is Pokemon an RPG? I honestly don't know. It's a really weird one because you play as this kind of blank slate character whose name and gender you can customize, but not really much else. You have to follow this very linear story path in which you can't really affect anything about the world around you. The biggest role-playing aspect of Pokemon is the team you choose. It's not really something that people would do, but hypothetically, if you wanted to really get like a real role-playing experience out of it, then maybe you could play through the whole game with like a mono-type team, you know, role-play a fire-type expert who only trains fire types. It's a bit of a stretch, but you know, the option is there, I suppose. That whole being able to choose your own team thing really is such a big deal. It's motivated repeat playthroughs for me in the past because I've gone back to a Pokemon game and said, oh, I want to use Carnivine this time, but you know, you've then got to look at like that bit at the end of Nugget Bridge in Generation 1 where you're asked if you want to join Team Rocket, and so many players wanted to join Team Rocket and say yes and see what it'd be like, but you're never actually given that option. And I think maybe if that was something that you could actually do, then you could consider Pokemon to be way more of an RPG, but that's not a role that you're allowed to play, and it's just kind of left as something that players have fantasized about for years now. Then there's Fire Emblem. More often than not in the later Fighter games, you can customize your protagonists to a certain extent, but you can't really do much about their personality and their background. And, you know, again, it's a bit of a stretch. You could say, well, I can choose whether or not I let my units die, but I think that might be taking it a bit too far. I'm not sure you can really roleplay too much in Fire Emblem. And the only way that your actions inside the gameplay are going to affect things outside of the gameplay is if your units die, or you let some of the neutral units die, and some of these small things that don't really have that much of an effect overall. Usually the story is going to play out pretty much the same way. Obviously, it should go without saying, but this whole thing is very subjective. It's very opinion based. This kind of definition and these defining traits of an RPG that I've come to in my video are very much my own personal take on things, and if you're not fully convinced by this video, then that's totally fine. I encourage you to do your own research and look into it and see how you feel about it. But this is me just kind of presenting my side of the argument, how I think these games have been kind of mischaracterized for years now, and how it would be great if we could change that. Realistically, I don't think we will, because it's so ingrained in our minds now, but hey, I mean, nothing ever gets done if no one says anything about it, right? I probably want to talk about New Vegas a bit more in a future video, because it's like one of my favorite games ever made. I think it's just incredible. But for the time being, that's about it from me, and I'll see you again soon. Why don't you go ahead and play the role of a person with good taste and like or subscribe. See? Options, decisions. You get to choose. Which one do you do? Preferably both. Please do both. That'd be really great.